Before the storm. The world that let Hitler rise, a true story of silence, suffering, and the slow march toward global fire before the tanks rolled, before the bombs fell, before the world caught fire. There was silence, a dangerous, deadly silence. The world didn't stumble into war in 1939. No, it drifted, blindfolded, into the abyss. The embers of the First World War had barely cooled before the sparks of the Second began to smoke. People thought the horrors of 1914 to 1918 could never happen again. They were wrong. In the grand halls of Versailles, a treaty was signed not to secure peace, but to plant the seeds of vengeance. Germany, shattered and humiliated, was blamed for the bloodshed of World War I, stripped of its military, its colonies, its pride, and crushed under the weight of impossible reparations. A nation once proud was now boiling beneath the surface. Out of that anger, that humiliation, and that silence came a voice, Adolf Hitler, of purity. And slowly, the whispers grew louder. With black shirts, propaganda, and a cult of personality, he promised a return of Roman glory. His model would inspire Hitler, not just in politics, but in violence. Not through war, but through a democracy that didn't know how to defend itself. The German people, desperate for hope, for food, for direction, followed. Built tanks, planes, and guns. In secret, then in public, he sent troops into the Rhineland, violating every treaty clause that kept Europe at peace. A failed painter, a soldier of the Great War. A man who promised to make Germany great again, not through healing, but through hate. They gave him the Sudetenland, a slice of Czechoslovakia. Hitler promised that would be enough. In beer halls and basements, he whispered poisonous promises to broken men, promises of strength, of revenge. The Nazis marched in, and still, the West stayed silent. By 1933, Hitler seized power, and the world watched. In Italy, a different beast had already taken shape. Benito Mussolini, the original fascist, rose to power a decade earlier. Meanwhile, in the East, the drums of war beat quietly under the rising sun. Japan, hungry for resources and status, invaded Manchuria in 1931. The first true act of World War II. The League of Nations condemned it. The Spanish Civil War became a blood-soaked rehearsal for World War II. Hitler and Mussolini supported Franco's fascist uprising, using it as a weapons test. Luftwaffe bombers, chemical warfare, and brutal street-to-street combat, and did nothing. The message was clear. Aggression would go unpunished. But while his paranoia hollowed his army, he was also building an industrial war machine, preparing for a storm he knew would come. Swallowed the city, broken every promise. Back in Germany, Hitler was watching. He rearmed his military illegally. And what did Britain and France do? Nothing. They believed in appeasement, that if you gave a dictator a little, he would stop. But dictators don't stop. They don't compromise. They consume. By 1938, Germany absorbed Austria and the Anschluss. Again, without a shot fired, crowds cheered. This wasn't peace. It was paralysis. In Spain, another warning came. The world watched as the Spanish town of Guernica was bombed into oblivion. The first time civilians were deliberately targeted from the sky. Pablo Picasso captured the horror on canvas. But leaders across Europe turned their eyes away. And in the Soviet Union, Stalin was watching and purging. Millions died in the Great Purge. Soldiers, officers, intellectuals, anyone Stalin feared. Then came 1939, the final act before the fire. Hitler had devoured Austria. Now, he wanted Poland. But first, he made a deal with his supposed enemy, Joseph Stalin. In the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Nazis and Soviets agreed to divide Eastern Europe, even as they swore to the world they wanted peace. With Poland marked for death, and Europe in a daze, the stage was set, the players in position, and the silence would not last much longer. The world had been warned, but no one listened. and the greatest war in human history was only days away. The world hears the thunder of war once again, but too late to stop it. September 1st, 1939. The silence shattered with the scream of the roar of panzers, and the marching boots of over 1.5 million German soldiers pouring across the border into Poland. It was the opening act of World War II. A brutal, calculated strike, as ruthless as it was fast. The Germans called it Fall, Weiss Case White. The world would come to know it as this was no traditional battle. It was a new form of warfare. Mechanized, mobile, and merciless. Refugees flooded the roads by the millions. Old men, mothers, children, all fleeing a force that gave no mercy. A storm of steel and fire that moved faster than any army in history. Cities were bombed from the air before troops even arrived. Bridges were destroyed. Railroads ripped apart. Communications severed in minutes. Civilians, not just soldiers, were targets. Polish cavalry, brave but tragically outgunned, faced German tanks with sabers. The odds were impossible. Towns fell in hours. The countryside burned, and as Poland burned, the world watched again. It was the beginning of what history calls the phony war. His plan was already in motion, and he knew they weren't ready to stop him. A strange, silent standoff. While Poland was being torn apart, September 3rd, 1939. 2 days after the invasion, Britain and France finally declared war on Nazi Germany, but they did not move. There were no tanks rolling east, no bombers flying toward Berlin. Just words and waiting. The Western Front remained quiet. Inside Berlin, Hitler was surprised. He hadn't expected Britain or France to act at all, but their declarations changed nothing. But for the millions who lived there, the suffering had only just begun. Stalin's Red Army stormed across the eastern frontier, meeting little resistance. He was right, hoping the war wouldn't come to them. Military planners called it a Sitzkrieg, a sitting war. There was time to prepare, time to think, but no one acted. While German forces crushed Poland from the west, something darker moved from the east. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the other side, honoring the secret clause of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Polish people, betrayed on both sides, stood alone. The world had not just allowed this invasion, it had enabled it. In less than 4 weeks, Poland was gone, its borders erased, its cities occupied, its people divided, half under the Nazi swastika, half under the Soviet Red Star. In the West, the silence returned, but it was the silence of fear, and with it, another message to the world. Hitler would go where he pleased. The West was still watching, and still waiting. For months after Poland's fall, Britain and France waited behind defensive lines. They hoped Hitler would stop. He didn't. Instead, he looked north. It was blitzkrieg on a continental scale. As winter crept in, Hitler turned his gaze to Scandinavia. Norway and Denmark were next. Why? Because Germany needed iron ore, and most of it came through Norway's ports. Control the sea, control the war. And so, in April 1940, German troops landed in both countries under the false flag of protection. Within days, both nations were occupied. Denmark surrendered in 6 hours. Norway resisted fiercely, but it too fell. By May 1940, the waiting was over. In a sudden, violent assault, Hitler unleashed his full force on France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, all in a single sweeping campaign. But that story, the fall of France, the miracle of Dunkirk, that's for the next chapter. Because before we move forward, we must pause here and ask a hard question. Why was the world so silent for so long? Some say the world was tired. still healing from the First War. Some say leaders were naive, believing treaties and talks could stop tyrants. Some say the world didn't care enough because it wasn't their homes burning yet. But history teaches us something bitter. Evil rarely begins with violence. It begins with silence, with appeasement, with looking the other way. The world of the 1930s had all the warnings and ignored them. The rise of Hitler, the fall of democracy in Europe, the invasion of China, the bombing of Guernica, the murder of political enemies, the persecution of Jews, the deals made in smoke-filled rooms, the borders redrawn in secret. Every step toward war was visible. Every signal was there. And yet, it was allowed to happen. What followed in the next 6 years would claim over 70 million lives, but it all began here. In the broken promises, in the ignored signs, in the soft footsteps of tanks crossing a border before dawn. This was the outbreak. This was the end of the old world, and the beginning of something far more terrible. France collapses, Britain is cornered, and the world gasps at Hitler's unstoppable war machine. May 10th, 1940, at exactly 5:35 a.m., the thunder rolled again. German tanks surged across the borders of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands in a perfectly choreographed military storm. This was not a repeat of the First World War. This was something faster, sharper, but as blitzkrieg refined. The strategy that had crushed Poland was now being unleashed against the heart of Western Europe. But Hitler did something no one expected. The Allies thought Hitler would push through Belgium and be slowed by the Maginot Line, a massive concrete fortress France had built along its eastern border. He sent his tanks through the Ardennes forest, a place the French believed was impassable for armor. They were wrong. In just a few days, the German army punched through and raced toward the English Channel, cutting off the best of the French and British armies. Nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers were trapped around the coastal town of Dunkirk. The noose was tightening. The war might have ended right there. But then, something miraculous happened. Over the course of 9 days, nearly 340,000 soldiers were evacuated. The miracle of Dunkirk. As the Luftwaffe rained bombs on the beaches, the British launched Operation Dynamo, a desperate plan to rescue as many troops as possible. Warships, fishing boats, even private yachts. Over 800 vessels crossed the English Channel under constant fire. They left their tanks, their guns, their supplies, but they survived. Back in London, a new prime minister had just taken office, a man with a bulldog's growl and an iron will. Winston Churchill. He didn't promise peace. He promised blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He rallied a terrified Britain with just one sentence. The French government surrendered on June 22, 1940, inside the very same rail car where Germany had signed its defeat in 1980. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender. A puppet regime called Vichy France was established in the south, loyal in name, but controlled by fear. But while Britain clung to its island hope, France collapsed. By June, German forces had overrun the country. Paris fell without resistance. Hitler stood there, smug, silent, and vengeful. To him, it wasn't just victory, it was revenge. France was divided. The Nazis occupied the north and west, but unbroken. He couldn't cross the English Channel with ships, not with the Royal Navy standing in his way. So he decided to crush Britain from the sky. Europe was now in chains. In just 6 weeks, Hitler had done what Kaiser Wilhelm couldn't in 4 years. He had conquered most of Western Europe. The skies become a graveyard of burning planes and broken bodies. But one enemy remained, outnumbered. They used radar, a new secret technology, to detect incoming waves of German aircraft. Their goal: destroy the Royal Air Force and pave the way for invasion. Small, isolated, bombarded. So Hitler changed tactics. The Battle of Britain begins July 1940. Hundreds of German bombers darken the skies over southern England. But the RAF fights back with speed, skill, and desperation. Young British pilots, barely in their 20s, fly sortie after sortie, sometimes 5 or 6 times a day. Churchill watches from command posts and rooftops, silently praying. Then, Hitler makes a mistake. After initial raids on airfields, he orders the Luftwaffe to begin bombing London and other cities directly. A campaign that would become known as the Blitz. Night after night, bombs rain down. Children sleep in subway tunnels. Families lose everything. Entire blocks reduced to rubble. But Britain does not break. In fact, the shift in strategy gives the RAF time to rebuild, regroup, and strike back. By October 1940, Hitler calls off the invasion. The British stand victorious, bloodied, but defiant. Churchill's words echo through time. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Europe had fallen, but Britain stood alone. And across the ocean, in a land not yet at war, another figure was watching. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The United States was still neutral, still trying to stay out of the fire. But soon, very soon, that fire would reach them. Europe was in chains. Poland, crushed. France, fallen. Belgium, Norway, the Netherlands, gone. Only Britain stood, battered but breathing. But Hitler wasn't done. Not even close. With Western Europe under Nazi control, he turned his gaze to a much older enemy. One he had always planned to destroy, the Soviet Union. In June 1941, the world would be stunned again when Hitler broke his non-aggression pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of warfare. But even before that moment, the storm was building across every corner of the globe, and another empire, far to the east, was preparing for conquest of its own. Because World War II was never meant to be a European conflict alone. It was global from the start. Imperial Japan. Long before Hitler marched into Poland, Japan had already invaded Manchuria and then launched full-scale war. Against China, cities like Nanjing were burned to the ground. Civilians massacred by the tens of thousands. Women, children. No one was spared. The West responded with concern, but no force. And like Hitler, Japan took the world's silence as permission. They dreamed of an empire. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, stretching from Korea to Indonesia. But to achieve it, they needed oil, steel, rubber, and most of those came from Western colonies. Japan looked at the Pacific. They saw their enemies, the United States, Britain, the Netherlands, and so they planned a preemptive strike. But in 1940, America was still watching from across the ocean. President Roosevelt walked a tightrope, helping Britain with supplies, while trying to keep America out of the war. The scars of World War I ran deep. The American people didn't want another conflict. It was called an arsenal of democracy. Guns, tanks, and supplies flowing from American factories to the front lines of freedom. A military pact that promised mutual support and signaled a terrifying new reality. But FDR knew the truth. The war would come to them, whether they wanted it or not. He passed the Lend-Lease Act, giving aid to Britain and later to the Soviet Union. Still, America was not yet in, but history moves on its own clock, and time was running out. In 1940, Hitler made a crucial mistake. He entered into a formal alliance with Italy and Japan, forming the Axis powers. The dictators were united. Hitler's racist ideology had begun as hate speech. But by 1940, it was policy. Genocide had not yet begun, but the machinery of death was being built. One controlled Western Europe. One ruled the skies over Asia. And the third, Mussolini, dreamed of rebuilding the Roman Empire through conquest in Africa and the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, across Europe, something darker, more hidden, was growing. The world would later call it the Holocaust. Jews were already being stripped of their rights, deported from their homes, herded into ghettos. And again, The world watched and did nothing. In the summer of 1940, Churchill reached out to Roosevelt with a no-legendary message. "Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." Roosevelt responded. Slowly, carefully, but even as the aid came, even as Britain held on, everyone knew. And even in 1940, the darkest year, that seed was beginning to grow. It wasn't enough, not yet, because fascism was not contained. It was spreading, it was winning. But history has a turning point. Every great storm carries within it the seed of resistance. In Britain, radar codebreakers, the RF. In Yugoslavia and France, whispers of resistance. In America, a slow but steady awakening. The fuse had been lit. The silence was over. In just 1 year, minus 1941, the war would explode in every direction. Operation Barbarossa would bring Nazi Germany into direct conflict with Stalin's Soviet Union. Pearl Harbor would drag the United States into the Pacific War. The Holocaust would begin its industrial horror, and the world would divide, not just by borders, but by ideology, by identity, by survival itself. But all of it, every battle, every death, every act of heroism or horror, traced back to the years we just witnessed. The silence of the 1930s, the appeasement, the deals, the fear, the hope that fascism could be managed when it had to be fought. World War II didn't begin in 1939. It began when the world stopped caring, when democracies stopped defending democracy, when hate became policy, and when people mistook peace at any cost for real peace. Before the bombs fell on London, before the tanks rolled into Russia, before the ships sank at Pearl Harbor, there was a warning. The world heard it and chose silence. And in that silence, the deadliest war in human history was born.